If a light source reflects between two mirrors, and this light source is closer to one mirror than the other, the information on the mirror that the light source is closer to will be expressed as a reflected light ring that is smaller and more contracted than the reflected light ring represented on the other mirror that their light source of necessity is farther from. And of course, the represented light circle on the opposing mirror that the light source is farther from will be more expanded and bigger light ring. So if the real light source is closer to mirror to the left than it is to mirror to the right, then the mirror to the left interior will experience a heightened vibrational or frequency states as these recursive membranes are closer to the energy of the surface, or coming closer to the energy that's described finitely on the topological state. So this means that the virtual phase space in the interior, and as separating the points of the membranes on the axis, or the timeline centered through all membranes, is narrowing. If the real object moves closer to this mirror, that means the virtual phase space that copies that distance changes proportional to that. So in other words, as the real object moves toward the mirror, the virtual phase space will move closer to that at the same rate of change. So this narrowing and the membranes coming closer together represent the real object coming closer to the end field, the surface. So we can consider the phase space as the hypothetical or imaginary springs existing between the membranes. So if you could picture, right now we have phase space that has no observable, measurable information that we can see, but we can see each assertion of the membrane and the information on those as it's introduced down through the infinite lattice. But if we can abstractly consider that this phase space between each membrane there's a spring, and the spring is connected to the membrane preceding it and the membrane going after it. Two membranes are connected due to the phase space, and we're describing the phase space as being a spring, not string, spring, S-P-R-I-N-G. So we can consider the phase space as a hypothetical or imaginary springs existing between the membranes. As the membranes get closer, the springs between are pushed together, as opposed to the spring stretching when the membranes move farther apart. So this contraction and expansion of the spring is dictated by the contraction and expansion of the distance between the real object existing outside the closed static string and to that string. So when the real object moves closer to the mirror, the phase space springs in between membranes gets tighter, closer together, contracts. So while left recursive system is contracting relative to its surface, that is the information light ring on the surface contracting toward the center of its relationship to the real particle outside the plane, the other entangled matrix on the right is exactly proportionally expanding, or the phase space or the spring on the right side. In other words, if the spring on the right side is being stretched, the string on the left side is being contracted. And very, very interesting concepts here, but concepts that we can really see is occurring in the relationship of the new understanding of the string relationship that I'm describing, the strings being reflective and recursive attributes of the relationship between energy and mass, i.e. holographic information. So this exact proportionate expansion and contraction keeps the system, or keeps the string, it creates equilibrium and balance. So the phase space between membranes if the phase space between membranes is increased, imagine two of those layers or membranes in recursion going farther apart, and remember each membrane has the point of a spring locked to it, then it's stretching the spring in between, or the phase space, or the opposite, contracting it. So the expansion of the recursive matrix on the right side is itself proportional to the expansion of a light ring on its manifold surface. So in other words, when the real object moves forward, the manifested information on the surface expands or moves farther away. But if the expansion of the recursive matrix on the right side is expanding, then this says that the light ring on the surface is expanding. So in other words, if the light ring on the surface is expanding like this, then as it expands in the recursive, it's expressed the opposite way, and it's expressed as stretching the strings and pushing the membranes farther apart. So this duality of mirror-to-mirror fields or entanglement always represents equilibrium, as represented by the spherical or torus relationship. And we'll get into later on what happens whenever two M fields are not exactly parallel to each other. And we're going to start talking about what happens when we start deviating the angle from parallelism, all kinds of different ways. And we're going to see that the spherical relationship to the string can actually, when we start doing that, start converting the string into more of an elliptical, oblate spheroid, or all variables in between, but still as confined to the spherical relationship or the torus relationship. So the strong interaction of the whole of the relationship of topology to recursion on both sides is expressed predominantly due to the relativity of the surfaces of the black holes, the surfaces of the manifolds to each other. And we consider this prime entanglement between two surfaces as being more strongly linked than the interactions of both sides. In this sense, we describe the entropic part of the system as the interactions of the recursive aspects of the relationship. And we could go even beyond that and say the gravitational and more mathematically tractable aspects of the relationship are defined in the recursive space and not defined at their surfaces. So now we can predict that the special relativistic principles of the Einstein equation exist due to the relativity of surfaces of the manifolds. Special relativity exists where the expansion contractions smoothly on the surface. The general relativistic attributes of the system, and therefore the Einstein equation, are explicit to the recursion of information from these black hole finite boundary conditions, the manifold. So this states that the event horizon, which would be the surface of the manifold, respectively right and left, represents a defined and finite volume of information existing on the surface of the medium. When I say finite, if the real object is motionless and the mirror is motionless, the information, the light ring won't move. But despite that, it can contract or expand relative to the motion of the real object toward the mirror. It still describes that the information on the surface is a finite body of information that's trapped on a one-dimensional plane. So once the relativity of surface to surface is established, then we see that the virtual recursive functions emerge, existing in the interiors, and then this transforms a finite condition to infinite timelines that are entangled, whereby one infinite function runs one direction as the other infinite function flows the exact opposite direction. On to the next video.